This is a book review for Thomas Piketty's Time for Socialism. Golnara got me this for Christmas. Merry Christmas. I've earlier reviewed Piketty's magnum opus, Capital in the 21st Century, and I'll provide a link for that below. Now, Golnara got me this book because she knew I'd find it interesting, I guess. She also knows that my students will ask me about it. Every year, I have students ask me if we should be communist, whether the profit motive is immoral, and why we don't teach the obvious solutions to the obvious and clear problems with our society. Every year I appreciate these questions and use it as an opportunity to think through them with the students using the economic frameworks we build in class. As a result, this video is part of my opportunity to prepare for these questions. In the same way as when I chat with my students, the goal here is not to define what's right or wrong, as people may have different values. Just to look at the arguments at hand and push on them a little, to see where they may be delicate to different evidence or different value judgments. It is only by doing this that we can cut through a group's rhetoric and have a conversation about what people truly care about. Furthermore, a lot of ground is covered in this book and here, so the discussion should be seen as cursory at best. More detailed discussion of specific issues is something we could do another time.
As with Capitalism, Time for Socialism is a book that makes arguments that should be aired, providing data to establish and support claims. Unlike Capital, it's not a long, comprehensive book, instead making Piketty's arguments through 5 years of newspaper articles that he has written. Sadly, this means that the arguments are less comprehensively made, and so to make sure we are being fair, we'll have to be quite clear about what we think the argument is before throwing around any criticism. Both Piketty and the Nolan's family over here are individuals that strongly believe in reducing the inequities in opportunities faced by individuals, and who see economics and justice as inextricably linked. Furthermore, we both believe in the importance of a democratic voice and entrenched rights to allow for this. But even with that framing, we feel like we have taken the same goals and come to very different understandings of how this should be applied.
Piketty notes that since his youth in the 1990s, he has moved from a strong belief in mainstream economics to what he defines as a more socialist perspective, where socialism is defined as a form of centralized action. This is interesting, as my personal journey has been the complete opposite. In my youth, I believed that centralization and decisions by experts were the elements missing from society, preventing justice and progress. While now I see as many cases, if not more, where it is a lack of belief in individuals that make choices when given the opportunity, that is what holds us back. Contrary to Piketty's introductory comments, property rights do play a role in a just society. While Piketty talks of the ideal economic system one wishes to set up as the goal for this book, I can't help but repeat to myself that I do not know what an ideal is. Just that I want people to feel secure and capable to make choices and live a good life. Ultimately, my ideal is unlikely to be the same as someone else's ideal. It's unlikely to match the ideal of many others. And so I wouldn't really want to impose that on people. Now, no single narrative is right, and these things differ policy by policy, even for Piketty. As a result, the clearest way to understand the book is to describe the arguments given and the facts that support it. Then we can discuss what we see as missing from these arguments and where these are potentially misleading, and where facts themselves aren't really facts, but are half facts. So over to Golnara to summarize the book.
This book is a series of newspaper articles linked together by common themes. There is no need to evaluate each article or even theme here in order to discuss what needs to be discussed. Instead, we want to pull together the threads of the worldview noted at the start of the book. Piketty notes from the start that he wishes to use the term socialism, but that is a term that can have many meanings. For example, in New Zealand, the term is fairly innocuous for most of us, while in the United States, it is loaded with severe negative connotations in much of the public consciousness. He then defines the key characteristics of what he views as socialism to his mind when he uses the term. There are 5 of these characteristics listed as. So the first one is equality of outcomes with a strong focus on reducing wealth inequality. The second one is equality of outcomes and the right to a minimum standard or bundle. This is the provision of goods on an equal basis through government or universal provision. The third one is participation through circulation of power and ownership. The fourth one is globalization, but not as it's done now. And the fifth one is universality and equality. These 5 characteristics of Piketty's socialism are the overarching policy goals that Piketty is supporting in this text, indicating that they can be widely applied as appropriate rules of thumb in opposition to whatever current policy settings exist. The case and context of this argument and for this argument is then given throughout the book through multiple newspaper articles where these tangible specific examples are intended to make a case for these more general points. Given this, let's look at each of these a bit more closely and think about a bit of friendly critical evaluation.
Friendly critical evaluation. I like that. Thanks, Gonara. So, we are thinking here just about equality of outcomes based on wealth inequality. Now, equality of outcomes can be quite a contentious term in different places, so we won't fixate too much on that, okay? We're not talking about a situation where people are being forced to have the same outcome, or outcomes are forced to be exactly the same, although the way that makes us feel is something we do want to keep in mind as we work through concepts. When we talk here about wealth inequality, let's try to figure out why it matters to some. To some people, wealth inequality sounds like the very definition of injustice, while to others, even mentioning inequality and wealth is compared to green-eyed envy. And I say this as someone with clearly green eyes. Many years ago, I wrote an article in the Dominion Post on how land was socially owned. It was a short article, and it was mainly to justify a land tax and how economists see it as an efficient tax, but to give it more of a basis about why we would collect that and what might be done with the revenue. In that way, the land tax we talked about was really just a rent that was being paid to government based on its ownership of the land, where government was a representative of society. Now, in this way, I feel that I've clearly signaled my own concern that the fruits of land and knowledge may fall into the hands of too few people. And yet, even given that predilection, I don't find the discussion in this book about wealth inequality and wealth inequality trends to be particularly enlightening. One of the starkest issues with Piketty's description of wealth inequality in this, and even in capital to a degree, is what's missed in the discussion. Wealth inequality is discussed without considering the change in the age distribution and the average age, even though over time we build up wealth as we get older and our lifetime luck leads to a dispersion in that wealth as we age. There's no description of its relation to the level and allocation of capital resources in an economy where wealth is constituting the value of capital items that are used for production, without indicating how the claim on that underlying group of production has changed. So you might have an asset, but because the government is turning around and taxing it, or because there's a lot of people who are also utilizing it with you without being owners, they have some claim on the income that is generated from that asset. Without considering changes in the risk-free rate and the ability to interpret wealth ratios. So the idea here being that if we have a decline in the risk-free rate, a decline in the amount you could earn if you saved your money in the bank, for example, wealth might go up even though your ability to actually generate income has not changed. Finally, there's no consideration of why we're only looking at narrow financial wealth and not the build-up of human capital. Education is a strong theme in the book, but how that constitutes human capital and how that would change our view on what wealth inequality is not made explicit, and education in that context is often treated in an inconsistent manner. Oh, for simplicity, given none of that was particularly simple, especially if you haven't come from an economics background, let's make a toy example that can help us think through some of the higher level issues here, not dig into everything we've talked about. So I'm going to take an economy with 3 people. Now, let's see if I can find these people. Okay, nope, not so far, but I've seen our capital. We have a factory. Now, we need someone to turn around and to own that factory, and so up comes our capitalist, yelling about it. That's great for them. So we have our capital owner, and they own the factory. Now, they live in that factory, and they work there themselves, so they spend their own time working there. Now, they don't work there by themselves, they also hire in 2 workers. So here they turn up looking nice and happy as well. Now, these workers, to make things simple, work there. They get paid a wage, and they also live there. So in a sense, this person owns their houses. This gives us 1 capitalist and 2 workers. Now, all 3 of these people feel the same insofar as they're involved in production in that factory. They are all putting in hours of their time into production there, but only one of them has the property rights of owning that factory. Now, this is an important thing through the book for Piketty, and it's an important thing for us to conceptualize a lot of these issues here. Now, there's some gross value added that occurs in this entire production process. Gross value added is essentially the accretion to GDP, specifically from what they're doing. So we'll often look at this and we'll say that there's some gross operating surplus, some amount that goes to the capital owner, and there's also some labor income that goes to workers. In this context, we'll often, when we look at the data, see half the income going to capitalists and half going to workers, so we're going to assume the same here. If 50% of the gross value added goes to the capitalist and then 50% goes to the workers, that means the workers get 25% each and the capitalist is getting 50%. This is income inequality in our national accounts measures. We're comparing the labor share and the capital share of income. Now, this feels a bit wrong to us. They're all doing the same thing. They're all working in a factory, and yet the capital owner is getting twice the income. We might see this immediately as some form of injustice. We may, even if we don't see it that way, just want to know why. But wait a sec, we actually haven't got to a sensible solution about asking how they can consume given what they're receiving. Gross value added doesn't take into account the fact that our capitalist needs to maintain their capital stock. They need to keep their capital useful. So what we really want to know is about household income, the amount the individual can consume given their share of the surplus from the production process. Now, part of the return from the capitalist will be used to maintain the capital equipment, but not part of the return from the labor workers. If we assume that's 20% of the total gross value added, that means we need to net that out for their household income. So that leaves them with 30% of gross value added as their income, while the 2 workers are receiving 25%. In that context, incomes are a lot more equal, but there's still a bit of income inequality where the capitalist, while doing what looks like is the same activity, is receiving a bit more. Once they're paid off maintaining their factory, they're receiving a greater amount of income than the people working for them. Now, that's a start. That's got us thinking about income inequality, but how about wealth inequality? The measures we're describing and the measure described by Piketty are financial wealth. So we have to look at the associated capital item. We can see there that there's a present value of cash flows. Namely, our capitalist is receiving the same labor income as everyone else, plus 5% of gross value added that they get as net income on top of that. If they were to sell the factory and then go and work in it, they would still receive 25% of gross value added, so that's their opportunity cost. But that additional 5%, that's the return that comes just from holding the asset. So the value of that asset will be 5% capitalized. If their discount rate was 10%, then we would turn around and we would get something that looks like 50% of gross value added. Now, if we want to work out our wealth, we would have that capitalized stream for that person and any savings they do. And we'd also have the savings of the workers as something they build up. Now, to make things easy, because I'm lazy, we're going to assume people spend what they earn and there's no savings. So our workers have no capital in this financial sense at all. And our capitalist just has that factory and its value. Now, what's wealth inequality here? It is infinite. We have infinite wealth inequality. Now, which one of these measures refers to our key concern when we discuss inequality of outcomes? I would argue that only the household income measure truly matters, as we would want to understand why inequality in that measure occurs. Is the capitalist taking on more risk? Are they actually providing intangible capital or working longer hours? Or is it purely luck or a matter of initial endowment? Each of these explanations then may give us a different lens on what an appropriate form of redistribution would be, or whether there should even be any redistribution. Piketty's views differ from this not because he differs in the way he describes what we're looking at. He could justifiably turn around and say, oh yes, you can correct for all of these things, and I still see quite a bit of inequality. To which my counter for that would be, we would see it in the income flows. So we should just largely look at income. His contention then would be that wealth itself generates power. It generates an ability to force redistribution towards yourself, to convince people to do things for you. It generates power beyond what you can consume. In this world, it's not the broad structure of inequality that's the issue. It's not that we measure a Gini coefficient of wealth across all people. It's the density at the top. It's the ability for people who are often termed the elites to turn around and claim resources from society as a whole because of the magnitude of wealth they have. So I would state that the term wealth inequality, when it's used here, is a rhetorical device that doesn't reflect what we often talk about when we're talking about inequality, which is something similar to variance across everyone. It is solely about looking at people at the very top. In that context, it is largely an argument about excessive power and a group that's holding power and concern about that power. And that turns up in a latter argument. So we'll cover that there. Oh, even if we accept that view on power, and as you'll see, we'll discuss it further, but even if we accepted that, we should not forget that saying we will do something about power does not change power structures per se. It's not the same as talking about redistributing that wealth. We have the coercive nature of the state itself. Governments have to have power to redistribute resources. And as a result, if we solely forget about that power, we can get into a situation where we're not comfortable with the situation we're in. Now, what do I mean there? I said situation a lot. Well, when I published my article on land ownership, I mentioned before that that was quite unpopular. Well, it was unpopular with my work colleagues. It was unpopular with the newspaper. It was unpopular with the readers. I received all sorts of articles. I had a couple of people that agreed with me, but generally people were very against the way I framed the issue. I realized here that my personal views may differ strongly from the views people hold about the state. I have significant trust in government. I was raised to have very significant trust in government. But that's probably well above the average of people that are around, and people are allowed to feel differently. Taking a step back, I can understand where people are coming from. The government is an institution that can be captured by vested interests itself, and isn't guaranteed that they will always act in the common good. While Piketty's noting that it's private wealth that can lead to coercion in government. In itself, giving the government coercive power to try to capture that wealth can lead to situations that lead to the same issues. It's a little bit trite to pretend like there is a side that will always be doing good without thinking through power dynamics fully and properly, which is why we'll have another chat about that in a section. Even with public ownership and the provision of income, there's a more tangible situation for people when they actually can say, I have a house. When they can actually grow their own food. When they can actually see and breathe clean air. And that tangible nature of owning the house, of seeing your own property right over it, rather than having a government-owned house and then being given the income to rent it off them, that's something that matters to individuals in a way that, a strict economic reading might not capture, where we might see them as equivalent. And if we're going to talk about power structures and we're going to talk about allocation, we have to recognize that difference. Trust and security both suggest that individuals themselves value and are willing to contribute within a society with clear property rights that they can share in. In that way, it is not the case, as Piketty notes, that property rights are not part of the solution. They are. It's just making sure that people feel included in them. It does point to some argument about thinking about wealth inequality and wealth amounts, but more an argument about the floor. An ability for someone to live and provide for themselves without reliance on others. Now, this isn't saying that they're completely to their own ends. That's saying that they have an endowment. They have some underlying floor, an endowment, so that they feel secure. It's not, one of those far right-wing talking points about us being in a state of nature where we all need to go and hunt each other. Okay, that's not just right-wing, that wasn't fair, but you understand where I'm coming from. It points to a reservation option if society demands too much, so that people feel like they can separate themselves from what society is demanding. Wealth inequality statistics don't tell us much about this. And if it's not considered critically, such statistics can paint a picture of injustice where none really exists. So we want to be very clear about how is this floor constituted, how is it being provided, and what exactly are we trying to say with these statistics. The discussion of wealth inequality is in part a red herring. The true issue, and the one that comes through this discussion, is that of a sufficient minimum standard, and concerns that institutional arrangements and structures that lead to regulatory capture and market failure are dealt with so that people are within what they view as a fair society when making their own choices. And that leads us right into this follow-up point. The follow-up point being equality of outcomes and rights to a minimum standard. Focus very much on the provision of equal products, but we're going to try to be a bit broader here and think about minimum standard as a concept, because that standard is very intrinsic to a lot of things, even outside of this book. Now, I better get the little dotty thing out, saying what it is. There it is. So, what do we mean when we say this? Well, if we focus on public provision, we can say there are three types of public provision, and we can consider them as different arguments. And these different arguments will lead to different trade-offs and different ways that the policy would function and what you would expect in terms of it being fair versus efficient. But they're all intrinsically intertwined. You're likely to see elements of all three of them whenever you discuss what is going on with public provision. So let's get them up. Okay, so the first one is the provision of absolute needs. When we have the provision of an absolute need, we're saying, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you need food, you need shelter. We need to make sure that that's provided for you in some way, because otherwise you're not fulfilling the basic capabilities of being alive. Secondly, we can talk about equalizing the relative position. So, this could be as trite as saying everyone could own a Louis Vuitton bag, but we know that's something that is quite fundamentally not right. We would see that as a bit of a status good. But what about when it comes to owning a tablet, and that tablet allowing you to actually do your education and communicate with your friends? Here it's capturing an element of your needs at a higher level, but it's also allowing you to be part of a society, be intrinsically related to other people and able to do things. If tablets did not exist, then there wouldn't be a need for it. Because they exist, the need arises. So in that way, your relative position can come within that. Now, how would this go in terms of public provision? It could well be that there are some goods that require to be provided, so we ensure that people have the same version of it, the same type, the same amount. And in that way, we deal with the concern around status goods because it's something that involves some element of necessity and would create issues for the person if they did not have it. You know, you can start getting into arguments about providing cell phones here. I think during COVID, and with how much cell phones became a requirement to even go out and do your shopping, there can be more of an argument around that there. Now, finally, you have the idea that is very common about public goods and market failures. So you can have direct public goods where they wouldn't be provided even though they're valuable to people because of free rider type issues. People will use it without paying for it. You can have products with significant market failures, such as due to asymmetric information. And you have goods with positive externalities or spillovers. So you go and do something such as learn about economics, and that makes you much more fun at dinner parties. And as a result, the government wants everyone to be entertaining at dinner parties because it makes us all smile and be happy. So they support people getting that type of education. There are all arguments here for turning around and having some form of public provision for that item. Now, it's very hard not to mix all three, as a single item of government expenditure can embody all of these. The key example I want to focus on being educational expenditure. Now, we need basic educational expenditure so that we can function at a base level in society, so we can talk to each other, so that we can go out and get a job. However, going and undertaking further education may be seen as providing spillovers. It might mean that you're a more productive member of society, or I don't particularly like that term. You may be more likely to turn around and not commit crime, or to be kind to other people. You might not be. These are just things I'm pulling out the top of my head. Finally, it may be that other people are building up their education, so for you to turn around and be able to function with them and do things with them, you need to get the same type of education or learn how to coordinate. Now, there can be public provision here. There can also be private institutions that do it, such as you getting direct education from a provider or learning on the job. It doesn't necessitate public provision. But if there's a substantial case and there's an identified market failure, or there's a spillover, you can start seeing why there would be an argument. Or if you're in a situation where there are people without the opportunity, providing the good may be seen as a way of building that opportunity. However, with all of this, it's important to be clear regarding the motivation. If you use a market failure argument to state that it would be more efficient to spend on a given item, but you motivate it using relative position, and then when someone pushes you, you push back with absolute need, your argument becomes incoherent, as each of these drivers, while related, can be quite separate and will actually lead to quite separate looking outcomes. At that stage, people will start using the idea of your argument, the concepts you put down, to push for other things in the same way. And given each of these will lead to different observed outcomes, your critics will simply pick the argument that appears to fail in the data and undermine what is being said. However, I have no experience with these things. I've grown up in New Zealand, born at the start of the fourth Labour government when New Zealand opened up to the world. It's Golnara that can speak with more authority and experience on the issue, since she grew up in the Soviet Union, where many items were provided by the state. Over to you, Goli.
Thanks, Matt. To my mind, there are actually two separate issues here that deserve attention. The first is how pre-distribution was used to achieve equality of outcomes and its costs. The second is the post-distribution that occurred in terms of the public provision of products, touching on the issues you have just discussed. I don't think that we can talk sensibly about one without the other, as the two are linked in terms of how they influence incentives. Communist Russia progressed from the status of a backward nation to the world's second-ranking industrial power. Most of this advance was made under a system of tight economic controls, which enabled the government to direct investment and labor into development of a heavy industrial base at the expense of other sectors of the economy. As the Soviet economy became stronger and more complex, the system of central controls became more cumbersome and less able to meet the nation's need. So, output growth started to fall. Why? Due to the lack of incentives and price signals. In a number of enterprises, the wage rates were fixed in such a way that the difference between the qualified and unqualified, heavy and light work disappeared almost completely. Equalization of pay leads to a situation where the unqualified worker doesn't strive after gaining qualifications, as they don't see any improvement in their personal position. The fact that wage rates even existed, which wasn't Lenin's first desire, indicated that the Soviet Union recognized it had to work within constraints. But if they couldn't use markets, what other incentive mechanisms could be used? The first solution that was tried were appeals to individual pride. Hunger for prestige was introduced. Red labor banners, distinguished scientific, technical, and arts worker medals, paired with small material awards added to those honors. This led to increasing status competition to achieve these awards, driving increasing corruption. During Stalin's time, the need for explicit pay differences was recognized, with the difference in pay between the lower and the higher grades of workers increased. From then on, those who didn't work were seen as parasites, and the view of from everybody according to his ability to everybody according to his work was introduced. However, pay differences never reflected the same differences as was observed in the Western world. Why? Because of underlying public provision associated with roles. The Soviet Union used direct ownership and provision of goods and services as a way of remunerating staff. And the big difference between this and other forms of remuneration was that it was not transparent. Such non-transparency drove corruption, with a culture of corruption leaching into everything that occurred. The Soviet system did provide you with your minimum needs, such as housing and effortless access to the job market, and hence a minimum income, as long as you were able to do the job you were told. However, if you had talents and skills and wanted to use them to progress, this was not possible. Well, almost not possible. Nationwide corruption was prominent. In education, for example, you had a chance to study hard and get into university, but say you had 5 places allocated to engineering in a given year, 3 or 4 of them would be already taken by some, such as a prosecutor or mayor's child, leaving hundreds of students to compete for a single place. Similar things would be observed in allocations of prestigious jobs, such as medical doctors, university lecturers, and more higher up in the hierarchy jobs, mayors, lawyers, heads of departments. The blockage of access to any of these sort of incentives led to a lost opportunities of talents. It was almost impossible to get into positions you were striving for if you didn't have any relatives, friends that could pretty much sort it out for you. This happened with everything. Better housing would go to people based on who they know. Better jobs would go to people who were better at socializing, and so on, so on. I have personal examples, but I feel a bit uncomfortable mentioning about them. Ultimately, for all its imperfections, outcomes in the West bear some relation to effort, and that link is essential for any sort of trust in society. Public provision can be just as corrosive as entrenched private sector inequality, and this is a trade-off that Piketty often misses.
That was interesting, thanks, Schoolie. So, to my mind, this does lead to a question. Why is Piketty so focused on government provision of these goods and services and not government provision of the income necessary to buy these goods and services that are privately produced? Now, there are good reasons why we might have direct public provision. We don't want to say that this is completely ruled out. There could be market failures stemming from asymmetric information, competition issues, institutional issues, spillovers, or externalities. Relatedly, there could be a broader inability for individuals to process what's going on, pull risk, and as a result, we might say that public provision could solve this, although that just tells us that maybe we should think about providing a minimum income standard instead. Behavioral economics itself might say that the issues with processing what's going on may lead people to make decisions and demand goods and services that aren't in their own interest. And there might be a reason why we'll go for public provision if people under-demand certain things. Finally, but quite differently to what we've just discussed, there may be social reasons for believing that everyone should receive the same product. It might enshrine some conception of equality of opportunity if everyone would receive the same thing, and it might engender a sense of shared experience. If everyone received the same milk every morning, they would know, hey, this is something we just get as people, and you wouldn't be judged for consuming it. You've heard similar arguments when people chat about school lunches and why everyone should receive them. However, this doesn't mean that public provision is just strictly going to be superior. We want to think through the different margins where that might not be the case. Now, what could these be? There can be inefficiency, which is traditionally what you hear. There are two things here. There are the issues that Golnara mentioned above, about lacking incentives and it affecting what's going on, but that also holds for general income redistribution rather than public provision. There's a broader issue of inefficiency here, insofar as we're thinking about government production of the goods and services. The idea here is that civil servants, unencumbered by the discipline of competition, would extract surplus for themselves by working less. This mirrors the idea that monopolies may experience X inefficiency because they lack competition. So it's not saying that this is particular to public servants, it's saying it's particular to large organizations and the lack of competitive pressure. A second idea that comes in is that when we have public provision, our ability to understand other metrics might fall apart a little bit, so we just want to note this. The interpretation of income and wealth inequality statistics may change. If we take our toy example from before, then we have a situation where there are three individuals all looking at producing something and sharing in the surplus from that. But if we know that government is providing education, food, housing, toilet paper and roads, would we feel differently about inequality of income and inequality of wealth than if they weren't? Now, this actually has a specific way of looking at it in the literature. It's called final income. And final income studies try to attribute these items of government provision and government expenditure directly to the individuals that benefit from them. Now, that sounds great, but these studies are fairly rare and often allocate expenditure in an ad hoc or subjective manner. Examples of these studies we have are Harding, Lloyd and Warren, 2006, Orton and Splinter, 2019, and SARS and Zuckman, 2020. Now, the last two especially aren't specifically looking at final income, but they're attributing government expenditure items from the national accounts. You'll see, if you go across all three of these studies, that they attribute things in a very different manner, and these have substantial distributional consequences. As a result, it does matter, and it's hard to incorporate. The third issue that we would like to think about when talking about public provision is actually preference, heterogeneity, and choice. Okay? It sounds nice to just provide something to someone, provide a house, but we're not thinking about what is lost, what is sacrificed. Now, when we have preference heterogeneity, this becomes clearer. If everyone desired the same thing and government knew about it, well then government provision doesn't seem to have risks. But one of the obvious ways that this comes in is that people may value things differently. So providing something without choice may simply mean that people don't get what they most desire. They don't have a choice about the type of healthcare or the type of education, and they're essentially working in some form of rationed environment. In that case, allowing people to reveal their preferences may have some benefit. However, it's really a second issue that's most important when we think about public provision writ large. How do you operationalize the provision of public goods? Now, I shouldn't use the word public good there, of goods produced by government. Everyone has a different amount of time turning around and deciding what educational outcomes to undertake, right? We all watch different videos, have different interests, and spend different amounts of time doing these things. Now, this extends to the idea of what your parents do with you. People ultimately have different educational opportunities because their parents will spend different amounts of time studying with them. If we were focused on equality or equality of outcomes, and we looked at the provision of education, which is something that Piketty does do, we may bemoan school choice as a way of generating inequalities. And in the essays Inequality in France and Par Scoop Could Do Better, Piketty explicitly makes the case that there is too much inequality in the options of what to do with education in France. Now, we could say as a result that we should limit the options and we should make sure that people have a similar educational background when they come in. And that sounds egalitarian. That seems like that would provide people a shared experience and help to reduce inequalities. So you can definitely see benefits there. But what happens if we start using the same argument to say that all children should go to boarding school to remove unequal opportunities from being taught at home? Some parents are diligent and make sure that their kids read. Some parents just want to let their kids run around and pick their nose. Now, there are benefits to both, of course, but it does lead to different outcomes and different experiences. So is such a dictate from above truly what we would observe as just? And if not, why not? What about if we stretch this further? What about a dictate that the same school material should be used by every student? You can't get a better calculator. You can't use a different pad because everyone should have the same experience. What about if children were banned from going on holiday and seeing their parents then to promote equality because some children wouldn't be able to spend very long at home? That time at home, they would get different experiences and they would then build different opportunities in the future, so perhaps we need to stop that. What about if children were taken at birth to prevent any parental-based advantage at all? Okay, now that last one seems clearly ridiculous, but it goes along the same designs, that we're trying to equalize the opportunity of people when they're young. If we're not careful about understanding where individual rights come in, and when views of individual rights are sufficient for us to say, no, we don't think that's the right policy to equalize things, then we haven't built an argument that will be able to turn around and push against very strong dictates by society, by state. We need a way to include individual choice while also trying to equalize opportunity. And at what level we draw that isn't something we can clearly have an answer for. All I can really say for this section is that measures of expenditure are essential for understanding outcomes and distributions. And we should be careful trying to be too dogmatic one way or the other. To go any deeper would require we add an extra hour to this video. So I'm not saying ultimately we should do nothing to redress opportunity inequalities. We should. I'm also not saying we should be fixated on only doing that and we should take away people's time with their family solely so we can all be the same. We're not trying to create an ideal person. We're trying to make sure people have equal opportunities, and making sure we can consistently communicate and understand that should be the goal of what we do. The issue with Piketty's Time for Socialism is that it will often only present one side of what is going on there. Next, Piketty is focused on power sharing, the sharing of power and the circulation of power and ownership. Now, this focus comes from two different directions that we want to keep quite separate. There's sharing of power within a firm through increased employee ownership and voting rights. And there's sharing of power within a society through greater taxation on wealth and inheritance and the provision of a minimum capital payment to all individuals. Both of these capture, in essence, what he sees around power. And so we want to turn around and address both of these. Now, when we think about the participation through circulation of power and ownership, there's a lot that's quite appealing. When we see structures of power that are making it difficult for people to have opportunities, we want to turn around and we want to equalize those opportunities by dealing with that power structure where we can. And ownership is one way that this power structure can be set up, can be put in. So it's very popular to say we should be doing that. But as noticed earlier on in this video, when we went and talked about the idea of land tax, that did undermine some concept, some ideal that people had about what they owned and what they had control of in their own life. Government and the state and society themselves have structures of power that can impress on the individual, so there's always a delicate balance going on. Now, within this context, let's focus first on the first of the points. Sharing power within a firm through increased employee ownership and voting rights. Intrinsically, this sounds good. We're saying that people that we view as having no power are given power by giving a claim on the capital within that firm. But let's pose a question to this. Why is tying an employee to an organization the way we want to address any imbalance between the employer and the employee in terms of power? In the article's Basic Income or Fair Wage and Rethinking the Capital Code, Piketty makes clear that it is unfair bargaining positions that he's interested in when addressing employee ownership schemes. There are other arguments. You can go through a number of OECD papers linking these schemes to productivity and wage gains for such firms, but Piketty rightly keeps his focus just on power because these types of studies are filled with selection bias issues that aren't properly addressed. Now, in that context, I think his structuring of the problem is right, but I just don't fully understand whether it's appropriate and don't feel that the trade-offs articulated are fully the trade-offs that are there. Maybe it's the New Zealander in me talking, but the ability to cleanly move between jobs, contribute to different projects, and move to whatever task appears to need me most is something that is positive. And rules that assume and enforce a situation where people have to stay tied to one job seems wrong on both social and an individual level. So the idea here is that if you suddenly own part of a firm, you become tied to that firm. You can't just turn around and say, actually, there's an outside option for me. As our toy example noted earlier, it was the combination of individuals, right? The employees and the employer that generated the gross value added. That was then split between the individuals. So you have that process where people are providing their skills to produce something, and then there's a bargaining position where they'll split it. The ability for the employee to force a move away helps them to be in a position to bargain a higher share of that surplus, a higher wage. The employer and employee's incentive to maintain and build capital, both physical and human capital, creates the surplus that is shared. If joint ownership helped them to do both, and they are both in a position of power, then they both have an incentive to do that already. They can choose to do this. So it doesn't seem necessary to dictate joint ownership. And such dictates appear to be quite blunt tools if power is what we are interested in. Such dictates are likely to have unintended consequences. They link an employee with a firm, potentially reducing their outside option, which may reduce their ability to actually receive that share of the surplus. They make the employee more exposed to shocks facing the firm, and they make the retirement savings of the individual less diversified because it's sunk in that firm. Ignoring any costs to capitalists, even from a pure worker's perspective, there are significant shortcomings that need to be worked through and described, and Piketty doesn't even loosely mention that these could exist. This is not to say that there's no room for equalizing bargaining positions, far from it. There's scope for employing improving employee rights in the face of monopsony, asymmetric information, and other intrinsic situations where employees are unable to gain their share of the surplus. Mobility itself is also not costless. The loss of firm-specific capital and insecurity associated with job movement and job fragility are very real. We can all feel them. But labour laws and fundamental income support appear to be ways to address this without the individual being tied to a job and to a business. So we want to keep that in mind. There are trade-offs here, and there might be alternatives that are superior. Just because we've found something that seems to address a problem doesn't mean it's necessarily the right solution. Now, if we move out to the social issue and think about the idea of a minimum capital payment, that fits within the narrative we've already talked about being supportive of when we talked about a social dividend from land. The incomes we all earn and the returns to our assets are in part due to the fact we are in a high productivity world. We are paid higher wages because of the fact that there is technology and there has been an accumulation of historic capital. As a result, when we go and we earn some income, it is not just the product of the sweat of our brow, it is also partially the result of an underlying stock of capital in a very broad sense. In such a case, ensuring that everyone starts off with a claim on that capital is something that seems consistent. Similar to this, recent research by Balboni et al., which was noted on Twitter by Matt Darling, indicates the importance of available capital for helping individuals get out of poverty traps. Making sure that people have a minimum amount of capital and an access to that in their lives allows them to make choices to select into jobs that meet their preferences and where they can build up value, and then allows them to live better lives. But with this, it's not just one-sided. It's not just the expenditure. We also need to think about how things are being financed. A decision to finance this with a wealth tax, which is Piketty suggesting, does increase the cost of capital and will reduce investment. We may see this as appropriate, we may see this as preferable to alternative forms of financing, but there will be a change of behavior we need to actually model and accept. We need to also ask ourselves, why is it that people who accumulate should be liable to pay more tax over their lifetime than those who have the same income but just enjoy spending more? We should also ask, what is the social dividend we're talking about redistributing so that we're claiming from that? It's captured ultimately in the transactions between individuals and the increased productivity that's observed with them. So why is that the figure we're not reallocating? When we say that there's distortions from doing so, what do those distortions mean, and how can we think about the equivalence between different instruments to understand what the behavioral changes would be? Given all of this, government revenues and expenditures and how they all fit together is how this claim, this minimum capital outlay to people, this minimum capital income, is then actioned. Now it's here that Piketty's argument becomes weak. The concept is strong about a minimum capital, but how it's actually actioned and operationalized leaves a lot to be desired. To raise the funds for this type of capital redistribution would require everyone to contribute on the basis of their share of this boon of productivity. The mechanism of a wealth tax, which we should view as a de facto more progressive tax scale that occurs on the capital side, is not sufficient. Whether you take the revenue estimates of Sarin and Summer or Sars and Zuckman, the higher which Piketty cites in Wealth Tax in America, such a tax at rates that creates a tax liability greater than the income flow, which is what is being suggested, would not be sufficient to fund the redistribution discussed, and would be orders of magnitude below what the Sarin and Summers estimates of improved broad tax enforcement and compliance would be. Now, I see this all as quite a red herring. Specifically, the comparison to history. Government expenditures to GDP are now higher in most countries than they were at any time in the past, and they're financed through broader funding measures. Piketty believes in greater expenditures by government as a percent of GDP than have occurred in the past, and that will require greater funding than in the past, with the consequences that creates. There is nothing wrong with believing in that, but we need to be clear about what the trade-offs are. You can believe in higher expenditures or lower expenditures, but each of them have trade-offs we need to be clear about for us to have a true democratic discussion about it. If the implied tax on income earned from an asset rose towards 100%, which is what the wealth tax suggested does in a number of cases, people would switch from considering how to avoid tax rather than deciding how to effectively utilize the asset. Marginal discussions of how user cost of capital changes would influence the capital stock, such as a paper that Gulnara and myself have recently undertaken, would not give us an accurate picture of this. You can't just scale up these small results, because these things tend to be non-linear. Once you get to taking away the entire surplus, people's behavior changes in quite stark ways. Now, this is the crux of the debate. Government expenditures and transfers, along with taxation, is how the minimum capital payment is operationalized and how it's undertaken now. And it is here now. The fact I can use a public road, go to a hospital for a nominal fee, and sit in a park all indicate that there is a type of minimum capital payment already. The questions that separate people are how large should that payment be, who should contribute to that payment, and who gets to choose how the capital is allocated. Does the government get to choose how it's allocated by going and providing the products themselves, or do we give individuals that capital to make choices for themselves? Now, these are all good questions, and to my mind, the real distinction between people with left and right wing views is along how you answer these questions, not the fact that these questions themselves exist. And a useful debate would try to make a case for why you would believe that it should be larger and that it should be allocated in a certain way and that there should be certain groups paying for it. So we should always be framing it in that way. Now, we're hitting the last couple of bits. We're actually going to do them together. Globalization and universality. Now, why have I stuck these last two options together, and why am I going to discuss them all as one? They seem like huge, important issues that we all very much care about. Well, there's an odd bit of rhetoric in here that you might see Globe Twitter disagreeing with. But the basis for both of these sections is global equality and anonymity in the treatment of individuals, which are essentially the same as the goals that Globe Twitter shares. In a sense, Piketty's arguments in this way are incredibly mainstream, even if the rhetoric used does seem to dive around a bit or fit in with certain groups. The guiding principle of any governance institution or any supranational organization should be to ensure equal treatment of individuals and support for minimum standards, where these are standards of equality that correct for differences in opportunity based on gender and ethnicity. Now, the entirety of Globe Twitter, people that constantly get called neoliberals, all that sort of jazz, would all agree with these ideas. There might be differences in how to action them, but the concepts themselves are all the same. Now, just like the majority of economists, including Gulnara and myself, this view may be read as naive. So even though most of us think about it, we do recognize that a lot of people in public see us as naive for viewing the world this way, idealistic. There'll be people who believe in the moral imperative of some culture or social arrangement, that there are some differences that are natural or necessary, and that it's practically impossible for coordination to occur at a supranational level. But economists are very used to asking about ideals, and if we can't say what we think is an ideal structure to treat people equally and fairly, then how can we even ask ourselves ever about what makes sense? Why should we assume that certain structures that themselves engender differential treatment of people are how it should be and are right? So personally, I find it refreshing that he talks in this way. When we look back to now, in 100 years' time, it will be our willingness to accept poverty in low-income nations that will lead our great-grandchildren to view us as immoral. Not the fact that someone said something inappropriate on Twitter about the way so-and-so was dressed. The fact that the left and right can only see injustice insofar as it relates to them or to their peer group, and not through our global refusal to support those most in need, is a clear failure in public discourse. And on these points, I have no real area of disagreement with Piketty. Articles such as Europe, Migrants and Trade and Manifesto for the Democratization of Europe also indicate that Piketty sees the inclusion and integration of migrants as part of this overall program. There's no distinguishing between people arbitrarily on the basis of the color of their skin or the luck of where they're born. This shows a consistency that an increasing number of economists have lost in recent years, as things have become more difficult to ascertain and understand. Now, where this view of equality does create disagreement is with how others will interpret Piketty, and sometimes with how he interprets himself in his own article. Now, Noah Smith had this great tweet which he put up, and you can see up here that there is this great looking graph. So he interprets this as saying, people complaining about capitalism are almost exclusively people in rich Western countries where capitalist globalization has caused the disappointment of the middle classes. Now, is the injustice here that some middle-class Americans have seen income growth stall, and it is Americans and other high-income countries we haven't seen the same magnitude of this? In fact, some countries, such as Australia and New Zealand, it has been largely the opposite. Or is true injustice due to the level of poverty in low-income countries? The idea here that if wealthy people simply had less wealth, then both the global poor and the middle class would be better off is just not true. Those with wealth are those who built and allocated capital in such a way that it helped to lift the truly poor out of poverty. And that was very much in their own interest, and they've benefited disproportionately from that, no doubt. But their actions are what created the capital and allocation of resources with global supply chains that has helped so many people in poor countries out of poverty. Now, reallocating from the most wealthy alone would not generate the revenues necessary to turn around and lift global expenditures in the way that Piketty suggests. And it also leads to a situation where, if done incorrectly, it could hurt those who are poor by meaning that they lose access to global supply chains. So in this way, we have Piketty from his very first article seeming to suggest that there's a zero-sum game you can go and reallocate resources between, when we have a complex interaction between all these different elements. And ultimately, we do want to think about what is fair and what is just given that, but we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. Now, why do I even raise this when I said I was relatively happy with his discussion of universality and globalization? Well, Piketty cites an earlier version of the graphic we have discussed in his article After Climate Denial, Inequality Denial. In this article, he makes the case that this just shows the inequalities he bemoans, which is fine. But then he also says that others that view it differently, such as The Economist magazine, are being dishonest, and that's not right. To argue from data, we need a counterfactual, we need a model. And acting as if this is some fixed sum of income to be reallocated is likely to be a poor counterfactual. Asking why is important, as it fits the idea that Piketty has at the start of this book, that debate is kept open. He says that we should do that, and this article tries to undermine that because he doesn't want to touch this thesis. And we should be willing to question it and willing to learn more about it. Questioning this also opens up other doors that he may have inadvertently shut with such a focus just on inequality metrics. Market power, concentration of firms, regulatory capture, unequal international treaties. All these issues can offer explanations for the distribution of income and wealth. All these issues are also issues he touches on in other places, but they suggest very different policy conclusions that differ just from expenditure and revenue raising. Understanding what's important and why is important for knowing what intervention is truly just. We can't just point to one set of numbers and do an unrelated intervention and say we're fixing things. We're doing it, we're fixing it, we're helping it. Justice involves us really trying to understand what's going on. It involves us really understanding trade-offs and sometimes challenging ourselves and being willing to be in situations where the thing that we want is not the thing that occurs. In this way, the rhetoric he uses is inconsistent, picking and choosing the cause and isolation based on the subject of the article. The honest interpretation that everyone who has benefited from technological growth over a long period of time would need to contribute to support redistribution, is missing. And that's where the elements come in. If the income change is not the product of technological growth, but instead due to power, we need to understand the power dynamic at play when considering the intervention we may want. If someone truly has power to capture regulators and to concentrate firms, they'll have the means of avoiding an instrument like a tax. They'll be able to lobby groups to get through. They'll be able to reclassify what they're doing. What we need to do is figure out where the power is at source and make sure that people are given sufficient power in their own lives and sufficient opportunities to reduce those excesses. To conclude this video, we'll note that we had a discussion of equality of outcomes, participation in the circulation of power and ownership, globalization, universality, and equality. Ultimately, there are important points to consider, but certain trade-offs just were not made, likely because this book was intended to make a case. But even if you're making a case, the truly strongest cases rely on showing where there's shortcomings and showing where a message can be misinterpreted. And this brings me to what I really want to note in my conclusion. This book and these arguments are all focused on good intentions. But the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Within any structure, institution, and society, it is always the way that the needs of the many can swamp the needs of the few, or even the wants of the many can swamp the needs of the few. We all have varying conceptions of justice due to different perspectives and experiences, different preferences, and different beliefs. The tyranny of the majority is a real thing, and it becomes strongest when change is driven in the name of justice and victory over some other that we see as oppressing us. The principles of universality and equality work only when the rights of the individual are enshrined and protected. And every single time we think of a neat scheme to improve some metrics of outcomes, we need to keep that in mind. This isn't some way to slow down progress, it is a way to stop our generation from becoming the monsters we read about in history books. A desire to do good needs to be balanced alongside humility and a recognition that we don't always know what is good. If we lose sight of what that is, we might lose the argument. But even worse, we might win it.